Think about the person in your life who is always there. The one you call when something falls apart. The one who picks up, who listens without checking the time, who somehow always knows what to say. The person others describe, without really thinking about it, as the reliable one. Now think about the last time you called to check on them. Not because something happened. Not because you needed something. Just to check in. To ask how they were doing and actually mean it. If that's taking longer to answer than you'd expect, you're not alone. And you're not the problem. Because the person everyone counts on has learned, somewhere along the way, to make themselves structurally unnecessary to worry about. They're always okay. Or they say they are. Or they perform okayness so consistently, so fluently, that it becomes impossible for the people around them to notice when it stops being true. And here's what's interesting. That's not an accident. The more available you are, the more people come to expect your availability. And eventually, your presence becomes so constant, so quietly woven into the background of everyone else's life, that the moment you need something, the moment the availability breaks, it catches people completely off guard. Not because they don't care, but because you never looked like someone who needed anything. And that's exactly what this is about. Psychologists studying what's often called compulsive caregiving, a pattern first described in John Bowlby's foundational work on attachment, outline a specific profile. A person who has learned, usually very early, to prioritize the emotional states of others over their own. Not because they're selfless by nature, but because, in the environment where this pattern formed, managing others' needs was simply safer than expressing their own. And one of the defining features of this pattern, the one that explains why the person who is always there eventually disappears when they're the one in need, is this: they stopped expecting anyone to show up for them. Not consciously. Not as a decision. As a quiet accumulation of evidence, gathered over years. They asked once or twice many times, and the response was inconsistent or insufficient or simply not there. So they stopped routing their needs outward. And eventually the route closed. The thing about always being the one who gives is that the cost is almost invisible. Doesn't come all at once. Accumulates. In relationships that drain more than they fill. In the inability to rest without guilt. In the quiet resentment you feel. And then feel ashamed of feeling. I've written about this accumulation. In much more depth than I can cover here. Link in the description. And in the first pinned comment. The strange thing about closed routes is that they become invisible. To everyone, including the person who closed them. The "I'm fine" isn't always a performance. For a lot of people inside this pattern, it's something stranger than that. It's a genuine translation problem. The interior language for "I'm struggling" has gone so unused for so long that it no longer flows easily. When someone asks how they're doing, they reach for it, and what comes out instead is fine. Not because they're hiding. Because somewhere in the architecture of how they learn to operate, struggling never found a reliable way out. Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness maps surprisingly well onto this dynamic. When a response, repeated over time, produces no result, the attempt eventually stops. Not from stubbornness or pride, but because the nervous system, which is always learning what works, concludes that this particular action is simply not worth the cost. And the cost here is real. Because asking for help and not being received, or being received in ways that feel burdensome or conditional or awkward, is not a neutral experience. Confirms something. And what it confirms, deep and quietly, is, I am better off alone with this. So they get better at being alone with it. Little by little. Without realizing that's what they're doing. And they get better at being there for others. 'Cause that works. That produces a result. That is the version of the relationship that has always been reliable. But there's something that almost nobody who loves these people understands. The moment the reliable one finally does need someone, the moment they're in pain, in crisis, at the edge of what they can carry alone, they are standing inside a relationship dynamic they themselves helped build. And the dynamic is one where they are the support, not the one who receives it. This isn't cruelty. It's a self-fulfilling architecture. Research on reciprocity in close relationships consistently shows that vulnerability is a bidirectional signal. When one person consistently shows up as capable, together, unfailing, they're quietly communicating that vulnerability in this relationship isn't something they need. And the other person reading that signal adapts. They stop practicing. They stop thinking to ask. They grow comfortable receiving without needing to offer the same in return. Not because they're bad people. Because they were never given the chance to be anything else. And that is what's most quietly devastating about this pattern. The person who is always there has often, without realizing it, trained the people closest to them not to notice when they're gone. And maybe that's really what separates people like this from everyone else. It's not that they give more. It's that they've built a world in which their absence barely makes a sound, because their presence was so constant it stopped being something anyone thought to value. They were always there. Until they weren't. And the room barely changed. You've been the listener for so many people. The one they call when something happens. The one who holds space. The one who knows how to make others feel seen. But when was the last time someone did that for you? I'm not asking to make you sad. I'm asking because I think you already know the answer. And it matters more than you've been letting it. I've written about this. Link in the description and first pinned comment. Now I want to speak to you directly. Think about the last time you were genuinely struggling. Not managing it. Not almost fine. Actually struggling. Who did you call? And if the answer is no one, or if the people you thought of, you immediately dismissed because you didn't want to be a burden, because it felt wrong, because the timing wasn't right, because they had their own things, I want you to notice that. Notice how automatic it was. How fast the decision happened. How deeply familiar the feeling is of turning inward instead of outward. And then ask yourself, where did you learn that? 'Cause it wasn't something you chose. It's something that formed around you slowly, in response to a world that was more reliable when you showed up for it than when you asked it to show up for you. There's a version of loneliness that doesn't look like loneliness from the outside. It looks like being someone people rely on. It looks like full calendars and people who call you and being known in your circles as the one who can handle it. And from the inside, from exactly where you're sitting, it feels like being the most present person in every room. And somehow still the least held. That's not strength. That's one of the heaviest things a person can carry quietly. And maybe the beginning of something different isn't a confrontation. Isn't a dramatic conversation with everyone who wasn't there when you needed them. Maybe it's smaller than that. Maybe it's the next time someone asks how you're doing. And you pause just for a moment and you tell them something true. Not everything. Just something real. Not as a test of whether they'll stay. Just as practice. As a small, deliberate act of letting someone see you. Because that version of you, the one who needs something sometimes, who isn't always okay, who reaches out instead of going quiet, that version deserves to exist too. If something in this video found you today, leave a comment. Tell me whether you recognized yourself in this or someone you love. I read every single one. And if you're not subscribed yet, this is exactly the kind of conversation this channel exists for. Subscribe, because what I'm covering next goes even deeper into why the most capable people are often the ones most quietly running on empty. The next video is about something that lives underneath all of this. Something most people spend an entire lifetime not naming.